Imagine stepping into a dimly lit Victorian parlor in the mid-1800s. The air is heavy with the scent of flowers, not for celebration, but for mourning. Black drapes cover the mirrors, the clock has been stopped at the moment of death, and family members dressed in black lace and veils gather solemnly. At the center of the room sits a figure in silence, dressed in their finest clothes, eyes closed as if in eternal rest. A photographer sets up his tripod, adjusts the heavy wooden camera, and prepares to capture the scene. But here's the unsettling truth. The subject he is about to photograph is not alive. This was no horror story. It was not a strange accident or a grotesque curiosity. It was a ritual, a practice so common in the Victorian era that it became almost ordinary. It was known as post-mortem photography, or more poetically, Memento Mori, the photograph of the dead. For grieving families of the 19th century, this was not macabre, it was a final farewell. A way to immortalize their loved one at a time when photography itself was still rare and precious. To us today, the idea might feel disturbing. The thought of sitting for a family portrait beside the corpse of a brother, sister, or even a child seems unthinkable. Yet in the 1800s, this was an act of love, an expression of grief, and above all, a desperate attempt to hold on to memory in an age when death was an unavoidable part of daily life. The Victorian world was no stranger to death. Disease swept through cities with brutal efficiency. Epidemics like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid claimed lives indiscriminately. Infant mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. 1 in every 3 children did not survive to adulthood. Medicine was primitive, and a simple fever or infection could mean the end. Families lived with the constant awareness that any day could be their last together. And so when death came, it was not hidden away in hospitals or mortuaries as it often is today. Death happened in the home, among family, and mourning was not a private affair, it was woven into the fabric of Victorian society. It was in this environment of grief and constant loss that photography found a new purpose. The camera, still a novel invention in the mid-19th century, became more than a scientific marvel. It became a tool of remembrance. For many families, commissioning a photograph of a deceased loved one was the only chance they would ever have to preserve their likeness. Unlike today, when we carry thousands of photos in our pockets, most Victorians had no image at all of their loved ones while alive. A post-mortem portrait was often the only tangible reminder they would ever possess. But how did this practice become so widespread? Why did people not only accept, but embrace the act of posing the dead as if they were still alive? And what do these haunting photographs reveal about the way Victorians understood death, grief, and memory? To answer these questions, we must step deeper into the world of the Victorians, their beliefs, their rituals, and their culture. We must look beyond the black veils and stiff portraits to uncover a society where death was not feared in silence, but confronted with ritual and remembrance. This is the dark history of Victorian post-mortem photography, a story that is not simply about death, but about love, loss, and the lengths families would go to hold on to both. Before we can fully understand why these photographs were taken, we must first step into the Victorian mindset itself, a world where mourning was not just an emotion but a duty, where grief shaped the way people dressed, behaved, and even decorated their homes. It was a society that embraced rituals of remembrance so deeply that even photography became a sacred part of mourning. So, in this next chapter, we'll explore the cultural landscape of the Victorian era, the religious beliefs, the obsession with mourning customs, and the way society itself was shaped by loss. We'll see how Queen Victoria's own grief over Prince Albert influenced a nation, and why photographing the dead became not only accepted, but often encouraged. To understand why post-mortem photography became such a widespread practice, we must first step inside the mind of the Victorian world, a society that lived with death not as a shadow at the edge of life, but as a constant companion. The 19th century was marked by a fragile relationship with mortality. Death was not hidden away in sterile hospital rooms or spoken of in hushed tones, as it often is today. It unfolded in the family home, in the bedroom, sometimes even in the very parlor where guests would later gather. Children grew up watching siblings and parents die. Families wore mourning clothes for months, sometimes years. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, their monuments towering like stone forests, reminders of how closely life and death coexisted. For the Victorians, mourning was not just an emotion, it was a performance, a ritual, and in many ways a social expectation. When someone died, their family entered a period of mourning that dictated almost every aspect of life. Black clothing was required, not just for funerals, but for months afterward. Jewelry was fashioned from locks of the deceased's hair, worn close to the heart. Homes displayed mourning crepe on doors and windows, signaling to neighbors and passers-by that grief lived inside. At the center of this cultural embrace of mourning stood Queen Victoria herself. In 1861, when her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died suddenly of typhoid fever, the young queen was plunged into grief so profound that it defined not just her own life, but the character of her entire nation. Victoria dressed in black mourning garments for the next 40 years, until her own death in 1901. Her refusal to move on normalized the idea that mourning was not a brief stage of life, but a permanent state of being. The public followed her example, adopting elaborate rituals that made grief not only visible, but honorable. Religion, too, played a central role in shaping this culture. The Victorians were steeped in Christian belief, particularly the promise of an afterlife. Death was seen not as an end, but as a transition, a passage to another existence where families hoped to reunite. Mourning customs were infused with this spiritual hope. Photographs of the dead then were not merely eerie tokens. They were seen as bridges, tangible connections between the world of the living and the world of the departed. To possess the image of a deceased child or parent was to hold evidence that their soul had not vanished, but continued elsewhere. This intense relationship with grief found its way into every form of art. Victorian literature overflowed with meditations on mortality. Poets wrote of tombs, angels, and eternal slumber. Painters created tender images of deathbeds filled with symbolism and sentiment. Even architecture reflected the obsession. Cemeteries like Highgate in London or Père Lachaise in Paris were designed like grand cities for the dead, with winding paths and ornate mausoleums. And so, when photography entered the scene, it naturally became another extension of these mourning practices. To modernize, a portrait of a lifeless child sitting beside her siblings or a mother photographed lying in eternal rest may appear unsettling. But for the Victorians, these images fit seamlessly into a cultural framework where death was familiar, where remembrance was sacred, and where grief demanded expression. Importantly, mourning was not only personal, it was also social. To grieve openly was to demonstrate loyalty, love, and moral strength. A family that refused to honor its dead risked judgment, even shame. Mourning clothes were not optional. They were a social code. To fail to display sorrow was to be accused of coldness or disrespect. In this way, the photograph of a deceased loved one was more than a private keepsake. It was also a public declaration, proof of love, proof of grief, proof of virtue. But this raises a crucial question. How did the Victorians manage to weave photography, still so new and rare, into this elaborate culture of death? The answer lies in timing. The early 19th century was a period when photography was just emerging as a miraculous new technology. Unlike today's endless stream of images, a single portrait was a treasure, often the only representation of a person's face that would ever exist. When a loved one died without ever having been photographed in life, families turned to post-mortem photography as their final chance. It was, in their eyes, a gift of memory, a way to hold on to what death had taken away, and it was entirely consistent with a culture that saw grief not as something to hide, but something to display. Thus, what might strike us today as eerie or grotesque was, for the Victorians, a practice both practical and profoundly emotional. The photograph was not only a keepsake of a face lost too soon, it was a continuation of an entire worldview that demanded grief be shown, that memory be preserved, and that love endure beyond the grave. But there is another layer to this story. Photography was not invented in the midst of this culture by accident. It was perfectly timed to meet the emotional needs of a grieving society. To understand the rise of post-mortem photography, we must now turn our attention to the birth of photography itself. How did this strange new invention come to intersect so intimately with death? How did technology, memory, and grief fuse into one haunting tradition? The Victorian obsession with remembrance would have found some outlet no matter what. But it was the invention of photography that gave grief a new and haunting form. To truly understand post-mortem portraits, we must first step back into the early decades of the 19th century, when the art of capturing an image was still a miracle. Before photography, people relied on painted portraits to remember their loved ones. But commissioning a painter was expensive, often reserved only for the wealthy elite. A working-class family, even a middle-class one, could rarely afford such luxuries. For most, when a child or spouse died, no likeness was left behind, only fading memories and perhaps a lock of hair, pressed into jewelry or a locket. That changed dramatically in 1839, when the daguerreotype was introduced to the world. The daguerreotype, named after its inventor Louis Daguerre, was the first widely used form of photography. The process was slow, delicate, and required long exposure times, but its results were astonishing. A precise, detailed likeness unlike anything paint could produce. For the first time in history, ordinary people could capture the real face of a loved one. By the mid-19th century, photography studios began to appear across Europe and America. For a price, families could have a portrait taken, a treasure that would last long after memory had faded. But there was a problem. Death often came before that opportunity. Many people, especially children, died before they ever had their photograph taken. And so, in an age when one's image could finally be preserved for the first time, the cruel timing of death denied families that possibility. It is here, in this painful gap, that post-mortem photography found its place. For grieving parents who had lost a child, or spouses who had lost a partner, post-mortem photography was not grotesque. It was salvation. It was the last, and sometimes only, chance to capture the likeness of a loved one before they vanished forever. The photograph became a way of resisting the finality of death, of saying, "You are gone, but I will not let your image disappear." At the time, photography was not a casual act. It was expensive and formal, often reserved for significant milestones, weddings, births, anniversaries. Death, sadly, was one of those milestones. Families treated post-mortem portraits as sacred, a last rite almost as important as the funeral itself. These images were often displayed in homes, placed in lockets, or tucked into albums alongside photographs of the living. There was no division. To the Victorians, death was part of life, and the dead remained members of the family even after they had passed. The very mechanics of early photography also made it uniquely suited to post-mortem portraiture. Daguerreotypes required long exposure times, meaning subjects had to remain perfectly still. For the living, this could be difficult. Any movement would blur the image. But for the deceased, there was no such challenge. The stillness of death became, ironically, an advantage. Photographers could pose the dead carefully and capture their likeness with an almost unsettling clarity. Of course, the process was not simple. Post-mortem photography required tact, patience, and artistry. Photographers often traveled to the homes of grieving families, bringing their heavy equipment into parlors where the deceased lay prepared. The camera, mounted on a tripod, would be positioned just so. The lens would be uncovered for long seconds, sometimes minutes, as the image burned onto a silver plate. And when it was done, the result was often breathtakingly lifelike. It was this realism that gave the photographs their haunting power. A painted portrait could soften death, idealize the subject, or render them in angelic symbolism. But a photograph showed the truth. Every detail of the face, every line, every feature, preserved exactly as it was. To Victorians, this truth was not frightening. It was precious. The intersection of photography and death also reflected a deeper cultural fascination with science and progress. The 19th century was an age of invention, discovery, and wonder. Photography was celebrated as a triumph of human ingenuity, a machine that could steal shadows and fix them forever. That such a tool could also preserve the dead seemed almost magical. It blurred the line between technology and spirituality, giving families a tangible piece of eternity. But perhaps most importantly, photography became a democratizing force. It allowed ordinary people, not just the aristocracy, to preserve memory. A laborer's family could afford a single portrait, and if death claimed a child before life allowed it, that portrait would be taken after the final breath. In this way, photography gave dignity to grief across all classes. Death did not discriminate, and neither, increasingly, did the lens. Yet as common as the practice became, each photograph carried immense emotional weight. To gaze upon the image of the dead was not an act of morbidity, it was an act of remembrance. These portraits were not tucked away in shame, they were displayed proudly, reminders that the bond between living and dead had not been broken. And so, photography was not only a new medium, it was a new language of grief. It translated loss into image, sorrow into permanence, and absence into presence. Families who once had nothing but fading memories now had something they could hold, touch, and pass down through generations. But how exactly were these haunting portraits made? How did photographers prepare bodies, pose them, and create the illusion of life so convincingly that, at first glance, many appear indistinguishable from ordinary portraits? To answer that, we must step inside the darkened rooms where families waited, and watch as photographers transformed death into a final act of dignity. The photographs themselves may appear serene, but behind every image lay a careful and often emotional process. Preparing the dead for the camera was both a ritual of mourning and a practical act. Families, photographers, and even undertakers all played roles in transforming a lifeless body into a subject worthy of remembrance. When a loved one died in the Victorian era, the body rarely left the home immediately. Death was intimate, unfolding within the walls of the family residence. Relatives washed the body, dressed it in its finest clothing, and often laid it out in the parlor or bedroom. The atmosphere was solemn but purposeful. Every detail mattered, for this was the family's last chance to honor the deceased before burial. Clothing was an important part of the preparation. Children might be dressed in white gowns, symbolizing purity and innocence, while adults were clothed in their best attire, sometimes even wedding garments. Jewelry, rosaries, or personal trinkets were placed with care. This was not only about appearance, it was about dignity. Families wanted their loved ones to be remembered at their best, not as victims of illness or suffering. The photographer's arrival marked the next stage. He would often travel to the home with his heavy camera and fragile plates, setting up in the very room where the body lay. In some cases, the deceased was placed in a chair, propped upright with supports, or positioned in bed as though peacefully asleep. In others, they were surrounded by family members, seated for a final portrait together. This was no small task. Bodies, particularly if death had come suddenly or after illness, required great care to be made presentable. Photographers used a variety of techniques to create the illusion of life. Some bodies were positioned with arms folded naturally, or hands arranged to hold flowers, prayer books, or toys. Infants were sometimes posed in their mother's arms, as though merely napping. Adults might be seated with open eyes, painted directly onto the photograph if necessary, or arranged to look contemplative, gazing away from the lens. For parents, the process was both heartbreaking and healing. To hold a deceased child still warm from death, to sit beside them for a photograph, was an act of both grief and love. In many images, siblings sit with their departed brother or sister, their faces solemn, their postures stiff. To modern eyes, these scenes can feel unsettling. Yet to those families, they were not scenes of horror, but of remembrance. The stillness of death, ironically, made these portraits technically easier to capture than photographs of the living. Early cameras required long exposure times, often demanding that subjects remain perfectly motionless for several seconds or even minutes. The dead, of course, did not move. This allowed photographers to achieve remarkable clarity in their images, something that living children, who often fidgeted, struggled to provide. Props and settings were chosen carefully. A favorite toy might be placed with a child, symbolizing innocence lost too soon. Flowers, especially lilies and roses, were common, representing purity, love, and the fleeting nature of life. In some photographs, coffins were included, open for one final viewing through the lens. In others, the deceased was arranged so naturally that only subtle clues, such as stiffness or unusual posture, revealed the truth. Lighting, too, was crucial. Photographers knew how to soften shadows, creating the illusion of vitality. A tilted head, a gentle hand placement, the fall of light across the face, all worked together to suggest tranquility rather than decay. Many portraits were so convincing that at a glance they appeared indistinguishable from ordinary family photographs. Only upon closer inspection did the unsettling stillness reveal itself. Of course, this process carried immense emotional weight. Imagine the silence of those rooms, broken only by the click of the camera shutter. The grief of parents who sat motionless beside their child, willing themselves to hold still as tears blurred their eyes. The determination of siblings, dressed in stiff clothes, told to look serious for the camera while grappling with loss beyond their years. These photographs were not only images, they were emotional performances, frozen in time. For photographers, this work required a delicate balance. They were craftsmen, but also caretakers of grief. Their role was to deliver an image that comforted rather than disturbed, one that honored the deceased while soothing the living. Many became specialists in the art, developing reputations not just for skill with the lens, but for compassion in the face of sorrow. The final results varied. Some portraits appear serene, peaceful, almost beautiful. Others carry an eerie, unsettling quality, as though the illusion of life sits just slightly askew. Yet all share the same purpose: to capture, to preserve, to defy the silence of death with the permanence of image. For the Victorians, this process was not morbid. It was sacred. It was their way of saying goodbye, of holding on to the presence of someone who could no longer stay. And while the preparation of the dead for photography might strike modern audiences as grim in its own time, it was an act of love. But what is most striking about these photographs is not only how the bodies were prepared, but how they were presented. For many families, the goal was not simply to show death, but to disguise it, to create, through pose and illusion, the sense that their loved one remained among the living. If the preparation of the dead was an act of dignity, then the posing of the dead was an act of illusion. To the Victorians, the photograph was not meant to be a stark reminder of death, but a comforting semblance of life. This desire for the illusion of vitality shaped how the deceased were positioned, staged, and even altered after the shutter had closed. At first glance, many Victorian post-mortem photographs appear indistinguishable from ordinary family portraits. The deceased might sit upright in a chair, a book resting in their hands, or stand supported by hidden props as if merely posing like everyone else. Children were arranged as though peacefully napping, their heads tilted gently to the side, their faces softened by light. To the grieving, these images were not grotesque, they were soothing. They blurred the line between absence and presence, between loss and memory. The challenge was always the same: how to make the body appear natural. Photographers developed techniques that were both practical and artistic. One of the most common methods was the use of posing stands, metal braces hidden behind chairs or beneath clothing that supported the deceased in upright positions. In group portraits, the dead might be seated among the living, their rigidity masked by the closeness of family members draping arms or hands gently across them. But sometimes the illusion went even further. Eyes closed in death could be painted open afterward on the photograph itself, transformed into glassy, staring gazes. In some cases, false pupils were drawn directly onto the eyelids before the picture was taken, giving the eerie suggestion of wakefulness. A touch of color might be added to the cheeks, softening the pallor of lifeless skin. These small deceptions created portraits that seemed vibrant enough to pass as life, at least at a distance. The goal was rarely to highlight death itself. Instead, families wanted to preserve a familiar likeness, one that could be remembered with comfort rather than horror. A child posed with a favorite toy, a father seated at his desk, a mother standing in her Sunday dress. These were not just corpses, but echoes of the living roles they once filled. The illusion allowed grief to soften into memory. Yet, the success of these illusions varied. Some photographs remain so convincing that modern viewers would never suspect the subject was dead. Others, however, reveal the tension of the deception. A slight stiffness in posture, a hand too limp, a gaze too still. These details betray the truth. It is this very tension, this fragile line between life and death, that gives the images their haunting power today. In group portraits, the illusion could be even more poignant. A family would gather together, surrounding the deceased with their presence. Parents might cradle a lifeless child in their arms, holding them as tenderly for the camera as they had in life. Siblings might sit shoulder to shoulder, their dead brother or sister propped among them, their faces solemn but composed. These images captured not only the departed, but the unity of those left behind. The illusion here was less about disguising death and more about asserting togetherness, that the family, even in loss, remained whole. There was also a subtle artistry in how photographers chose to frame their subjects. Lighting was used to highlight features, softening expressions and concealing signs of decay. Backgrounds were often plain, directing the viewer's focus entirely onto the subject. Sometimes the dead were photographed alone, as if to emphasize individuality and presence. Other times, they were part of a tableau, woven seamlessly into the family unit. These illusions reveal much about Victorian attitudes toward death. For them, death was not an abrupt erasure but a gradual passage. The body lingered in the home, the memory persisted in images, and the illusion of life extended grief into continuity. The photograph became a bridge between presence and absence, ensuring that love did not end with the final breath. Of course, not everyone accepted these illusions without unease. Even in the 19th century, some found the practice unsettling, even macabre. Critics viewed the attempts to disguise death as morbid denial, a refusal to face reality. Yet for grieving families, the comfort outweighed the criticism. To hold an image that looked alive was to hold, if only briefly, the feeling that their loved one was not entirely gone. Today, these photographs can appear eerie, even disturbing, precisely because of their effectiveness. They are not images of decay or horror, but of life interrupted. The stillness, the silence, the delicate attempts at vitality all combine to produce an uncanny effect. They remind us not just of the fragility of life, but of the lengths to which humans will go to resist forgetting. Ultimately, the illusion of life in Victorian post-mortem photography was not deception in the cruel sense of the word. It was compassion disguised as artistry. It was a final gift from the living to the dead. The chance to be remembered as they once were, not as death left them. The camera became not just a recorder of reality, but a creator of memory, reshaping grief into permanence. And yet, this illusion also raises unsettling questions. How much of memory is truth, and how much is invention? Were these photographs faithful representations, or were they comforting fictions crafted to soothe unbearable pain? The Victorians seemed unconcerned with the distinction. For them, memory was not about accuracy, it was about love. Of all the images left behind by Victorian post-mortem photography, none are more haunting or heartbreaking than those of children. To modern eyes, the sight of a lifeless child carefully arranged in a cradle or seated upright among siblings evokes an almost unbearable sorrow. And yet, in the 19th century, these photographs were among the most common and most cherished. They were not meant to shock, but to console, to hold on to a brief life that had slipped away too soon. The Victorian era was an age when childhood was fragile. Disease, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge meant that infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. Families often lost multiple children, sometimes in quick succession. In this grim reality, death was not an unexpected tragedy, but a constant companion in family life. For many parents, a post-mortem photograph was the first and last portrait ever taken of their child. These portraits often carried a symbolism of innocence, purity, and angelic peace. Children were arranged to look as though they were only sleeping, their tiny hands folded across their chest or clasping a favorite toy. The effect was gentle, almost serene, a visual reassurance that the child had simply drifted into another world. Some were posed in carriages or cribs, as if still resting in the comfort of their everyday surroundings. Others were dressed in white garments, a deliberate echo of angelic imagery and Christian symbolism. Flowers frequently appeared in these photographs, particularly lilies and roses, symbols of purity and fleeting life. In some cases, wreaths or crowns were placed upon the child's head, transforming them into a vision of innocence sanctified. For grieving families, this symbolism was not macabre, but sacred, a way to frame loss within the language of faith and hope. There is also an intimacy in these images that makes them deeply moving. Parents cradled their lifeless infants in their arms, holding them close for the camera, as though unwilling to let go. Siblings gathered around the child, their faces solemn, their bodies leaning in protectively. These group portraits are among the most powerful, not only capturing the child who had passed, but also the emotional weight of the family left behind. The living and the dead are bound together in one final moment of closeness. What makes these photographs especially poignant is how ordinary they often appear. A mother seated with her child on her lap could just as easily be mistaken for a living portrait, until the stillness of the child becomes unmistakable. In other images, the faint traces of artifice emerge. Eyes that are painted open, skin touched with color to suggest vitality, limbs stiff despite attempts at natural positioning. These details remind us of the photographer's delicate role in shaping grief into memory. To Victorian parents, however, these illusions were not deceit, but acts of devotion. The photograph became an object of remembrance, one that could be kept in lockets, displayed on mantels, or tucked into family albums. Holding such an image offered comfort, a tangible presence in a world where loss could feel like disappearance. The child's face, preserved by the lens, became a shield against the erosion of memory. The emotional intensity of these portraits was reinforced by cultural beliefs of the time. Victorians viewed children as embodiments of purity, untainted by the sins of adulthood. Their deaths, though tragic, were often framed within a religious context as returning to God or becoming angels. The photographs, then, were not only keepsakes but visual affirmations of this belief, that the child had transcended suffering and entered eternal peace. Yet, not all responses were reverent. Even in the 19th century, some critics found the practice unsettling. To them, photographing dead children blurred boundaries between remembrance and morbidity. For modern viewers, the images can feel uncanny precisely because they appear so close to life and yet so obviously removed from it. This dissonance between innocence and mortality gives the photographs their haunting power. One striking aspect of these portraits is how they contrast with modern attitudes toward childhood death. Today, in many cultures, the death of a child is often shrouded in silence. Photographs of the dead are rarely taken, and grief is often expressed privately. For the Victorians, however, the post-mortem portrait was a socially accepted ritual, one that provided a communal language for mourning. In this way, their approach to grief was more open and visible, even if to us it seems strange. The photographs of children also highlight the artistry of the photographers themselves. They had to balance sensitivity with technical skill, often working in homes filled with grief. Their task was not simply to capture an image, but to create a vision of peace, to transform tragedy into something families could hold on to. In this sense, they were not merely technicians, but mediators between life, death, and memory. For us today, these images continue to evoke fascination and unease. They confront us with the fragility of childhood, the universality of loss, and the tenderness with which families sought to preserve what little time they had. They remind us that behind each image lies a story of love and sorrow, a family grappling with the most painful of goodbyes. Perhaps this is why the photographs remain so haunting. They are not simply relics of a strange Victorian ritual. They are evidence of humanity's desperate need to hold on, to find beauty even in loss, to immortalize innocence before it fades. In these portraits, grief is transformed into art, and memory into permanence. While many Victorian families saw post-mortem photography as an act of love, Not everyone, then or now, viewed the practice with the same reverence. For every grieving parent clutching the last image of a child, there were skeptics and critics who saw the act as unsettling, even grotesque. The tension between devotion and discomfort gave rise to controversy that has echoed long beyond the 19th century. Even during the height of the tradition, there were whispers of unease. Some observers questioned whether it was appropriate to arrange the dead as if they were still alive. Was this truly remembrance, or was it denial? The photographs blurred lines between reality and illusion, and not everyone was comfortable with that ambiguity. Religious critics, too, occasionally condemned the practice as vain or morbid, arguing that true faith should rest in spiritual afterlife rather than earthly images. Still, the strongest waves of criticism came not from contemporaries, but from later generations. As cultural attitudes toward death shifted in the 20th century, the images began to be seen less as sacred keepsakes and more as eerie relics. Modern viewers, conditioned to hide death away in hospitals and funeral homes, often recoil at the intimacy of the photographs. What the Victorians saw as comfort, we are quick to label macabre. A major source of misunderstanding lies in the myths that have grown around these images. Today, countless collections of creepy Victorian photos circulate online, many of them claiming that the stiff, blank-faced subjects are dead. In truth, not every somber portrait from the era was post-mortem. Early photography required long exposure times, which often left sitters looking stiff or blurred if they moved. This has fueled widespread misidentification, where ordinary portraits are mistaken for death photography. The result is a distorted view of the tradition. People assume that death portraits were everywhere, when in fact they were a specific, if meaningful, subset of Victorian photography. The myth that every strange old photograph is of a corpse has turned what was once an act of mourning into a spectacle of horror. The internet age, hungry for shock value, has amplified this misconception, often stripping the images of their context. Ethical debates also surround how these photographs should be handled today. Should they be displayed in museums, collected by enthusiasts, or shared online? Some argue that exhibiting them as curiosities disrespects the dignity of those pictured. Others counter that they are historical documents, valuable not only for their artistry, but for what they reveal about Victorian society and grief. The question becomes, are we honoring memory or exploiting it? The debate is complicated further by the voyeuristic allure these images now hold. For modern audiences steeped in horror films and gothic aesthetics, Victorian post-mortem photographs are often consumed as spooky entertainment. Websites label them creepy, YouTube videos frame them as ghostly oddities, and social media circulates them for shock factor. In this process, the original meaning, the tenderness, the grief, the love, is often erased. And yet, part of the discomfort is also cultural. Victorians lived in a world where death was a constant, visible presence. They prepared bodies at home, held wakes in their parlors, and openly engaged in mourning rituals. For them, the photograph was simply another extension of this intimacy with death. By contrast, modern societies, especially in the West, have distanced themselves from mortality. Death is hidden away, sanitized and spoken of in hushed tones. What was once normal now feels taboo. There is also the unsettling power of the images themselves. Even when we know the cultural context, the photographs still challenge our instincts. The stiffness of the poses, the illusion of life painted onto lifeless faces, the presence of grieving families surrounding the deceased. These details provoke a visceral reaction. We are confronted with something both tender and eerie, a paradox that is difficult to resolve. But perhaps that is exactly why these photographs continue to resonate. They reveal the contradictions of human grief, the desire to remember and the need to conceal, the reverence for life and the denial of its end. The criticisms, both then and now, highlight our own discomfort with mortality as much as they critique the Victorians themselves. The controversy surrounding post-mortem photography reminds us that mourning is never universal. What feels sacred to one generation can appear unsettling to another. What one family treasures as a final connection to their child, another might see as a disturbing relic. These tensions do not diminish the meaning of the photographs. They instead reflect the shifting boundaries of culture, faith, and emotion across time. In the end, the misunderstanding of Victorian death portraits is perhaps inevitable. They sit at the crossroads of love and loss, art and mortality, comfort and unease. They are not easy images, nor were they meant to be. They challenge us to confront the reality of death, while also showing the extraordinary lengths to which the human heart will go to preserve memory. Every cultural ritual, no matter how deeply rooted, eventually shifts with time. Victorian post-mortem photography was no exception. By the turn of the 20th century, the practice that had once been a cherished means of remembrance began to fade, leaving behind only the haunting images that survive today. Its decline was not abrupt but gradual, shaped by sweeping changes in medicine, technology, and society. One of the most significant factors was the transformation of medicine and public health. In the mid-19th century, high child mortality made death an ever-present shadow. Diseases like diphtheria, cholera, and tuberculosis claimed lives frequently and swiftly. Families clung to photographs of the dead because so many never had the chance to pose for a living portrait. But as sanitation improved, vaccines emerged, and medical knowledge advanced, the once common tragedy of infant and child death began to lessen. Parents no longer faced losses routinely, and as death retreated from everyday life, the need for post-mortem portraits diminished. At the same time, photography itself was evolving. In its earliest decades, a single image was costly and time-consuming. Daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and early prints were treasured objects, often the only photograph a family would ever own. In that context, a post-mortem portrait was not merely an option, it was sometimes the only chance to secure any likeness at all. By the late 19th century, however, photography had become far more accessible. The introduction of cheaper processors and portable cameras, particularly with George Eastman's Kodak in the 1880s, revolutionized how families captured memories. Suddenly, photographs were no longer rare treasures. People could afford to take multiple images across a lifetime, from babyhood to adulthood, ensuring that death was not the only opportunity to capture a face. With albums filled with living smiles, the role of the death portrait became redundant. Cultural attitudes were changing as well. The Victorians had embraced mourning as a visible public practice. Black clothing, elaborate funerals, and memorial rituals were woven into the fabric of daily life. Queen Victoria herself famously mourned her husband, Prince Albert, for decades, influencing an entire era of somber devotion. But by the early 20th century, society began to turn away from such heavy displays of grief. The world grew restless with modernity, industry, and progress. And death, once integrated into the rhythms of home life, was increasingly pushed out of sight. This shift was reflected in the handling of death itself. In the Victorian period, it was common for the body to remain in the home, washed, dressed, and prepared by family members. Photographers would arrive at private parlors to stage portraits, surrounded by the intimacy of domestic mourning. But as funeral parlors and professional undertakers rose in popularity, death was gradually removed from the household. It became something to be managed elsewhere, by professionals, away from the daily lives of the family. As this happened, the intimacy that gave rise to post-mortem photography no longer had a natural setting. The rise of modern sensibilities also played a role. By the early 20th century, post-mortem portraits began to be viewed less as tokens of love and more as unsettling remnants of a bygone age. The increasing association of photography with vitality, capturing laughter, movement, and moments of joy, clashed with the stillness of death portraits. What Victorians had seen as comforting illusions now appeared to younger generations as eerie or morbid. It is important to note, however, that the tradition did not vanish overnight. In rural communities and among families with limited access to photography, post-mortem images continued well into the early 20th century. Some even persisted into the 1930s in certain parts of Europe and America. But in mainstream culture, the practice became increasingly rare, overshadowed by modern photographic trends and shifting cultural norms. Another factor was the broader transformation in how people engaged with memory itself. In the Victorian period, photographs were physical relics, fragile, tangible tokens of a person's presence. By the 20th century, the sheer abundance of images began to change their meaning. Memory was no longer bound to a single cherished photograph, but spread across dozens, even hundreds of snapshots. In this flood of images, the singular weight of the death portrait diminished. The decline of post-mortem photography also mirrored larger shifts in Western attitudes toward mortality. The Victorians had confronted death directly, weaving it into art, literature, and daily rituals. By contrast, modern culture increasingly distanced itself from death, pushing it into hospitals, funeral homes, and whispers. Post-mortem photography became a casualty of this change, a ritual too intimate, too direct for a society that now preferred to keep death hidden. Yet, even as the practice faded, the photographs themselves endured. They were tucked into family albums, preserved in attics, or eventually collected by historians and enthusiasts. Though the tradition declined, its legacy lingered in the images that continue to surface, each carrying with it a story of grief, love, and remembrance. The decline of post-mortem photography was not just the end of a custom, it marked a profound cultural transition. It reflected the movement from a world where death was part of daily life to one where it became increasingly invisible. It revealed how technology reshaped memory, shifting from rare, sacred images to abundant, casual snapshots. And it showed how mourning, once public and visible, became increasingly private and subdued. In this way, the end of post-mortem photography tells us as much about modernity as its rise tells us about the Victorians. Where once grief had been preserved in carefully staged images of the dead, it now found new forms, diaries, letters, and eventually, in our own time, digital memorials online. Death had not vanished, but the ways in which people chose to face it had changed irrevocably. Though the practice of post-mortem photography largely disappeared by the early 20th century, the images it produced have never truly vanished. Instead, they linger, passed down in family albums, preserved in archives, and increasingly shared on the internet. Today, these photographs provoke fascination, discomfort, and even a kind of aesthetic admiration. They stand at a crossroads of history and emotion, embodying the tension between the sacred intention of their creators and the eerie effect they have on us now. One reason these images captivate modern audiences is their sheer strangeness. To a society that hides death behind hospital curtains and polished coffins, the idea of posing with the dead feels alien, almost unthinkable. The Victorians' openness to death unsettles us because it exposes how differently we approach mortality. But they invited the camera into their grief. We avert our eyes. The photographs force us to confront what we've tried to suppress, the inescapable reality of death. And yet, alongside the discomfort is undeniable intrigue. Collectors, historians, and museums have preserved thousands of these portraits, recognizing their value as both cultural artifacts and deeply human documents. Exhibitions featuring Victorian death photography often draw large crowds, not merely out of morbid curiosity, but from a genuine desire to understand how earlier generations lived and died. These photographs provide insight into mourning practices, religious beliefs, and family dynamics in a world shaped by grief. The fascination also extends into popular culture. Post-mortem photographs have influenced Gothic literature, horror films, and even fashion aesthetics. Their uncanny quality, figures caught between life and death, stillness and presence, resonates with the same instincts that fuel ghost stories and supernatural legends. It is no coincidence that films and novels with Gothic undertones often echo the visual style of Victorian death portraits. Shadowed lighting, pale faces, stiff poses. They are part of the imagery of our collective imagination. The internet, too, has revived the visibility of these images, albeit in ways that sometimes strip them of nuance. Countless websites, social media posts, and videos label them as creepy Victorian photos, showcasing them as curiosities meant to shock. Out of context, they are consumed like haunted artifacts, fueling myths that every old, stiff portrait must depict a corpse. While this sensationalism misrepresents the tradition, it also testifies to the image's enduring power to capture attention. Few other photographs from the 19th century command the same viral fascination. For scholars and archivists, however, the legacy of these photographs is treated with greater care. Academic studies analyze them as part of visual culture, exploring how they reflect Victorian attitudes toward memory, spirituality, and mortality. Museums that display them often frame them within broader exhibits on mourning practices, emphasizing that these were not morbid trophies, but acts of devotion. When contextualized properly, the images regain some of the tenderness their original owners felt. The emotional impact of these photographs is what makes them so compelling today. Strip away the Gothic overtones and internet myths, and what remains are portraits of love in the face of loss. A mother holding her dead infant, a family surrounding a lifeless father, a child propped in a chair, eyes closed in eternal rest. They are painful, yes, but they are also deeply human. They remind us that grief is universal, transcending centuries. In many ways, the persistence of these photographs in our cultural imagination reveals as much about us as it does about the Victorians. We live in an age of endless photography, where billions of images are snapped every day and shared instantly across the globe. And yet, death remains largely invisible in this flood of imagery. Funerals are rarely photographed, and memorialization often takes the form of digital posts rather than physical portraits. The Victorian photographs jar us because they expose a gap in our own visual record, the absence of death in the age of images. This may also explain why the photographs continue to inspire artistic reinterpretation. Modern photographers, artists, and filmmakers borrow from their aesthetic not just for shock but for resonance. The visual language of post-mortem photography, the stillness, the stark lighting, the blending of sorrow and dignity, has become a template for exploring themes of mortality and memory in creative works. The images live on, not merely as relics but as inspirations. At the same time, the ethical debate continues. Should we, as outsiders, view these private moments of grief? Is it right to circulate them as curiosities when they were once sacred family mementos? Some argue that sharing them dishonors the dead and trivializes the pain of their families. Others contend that history must be seen to be understood, and that the photographs now serve a public role beyond their original private purpose. This debate ensures that the photographs remain not just artifacts, but living subjects of cultural conversation. What is undeniable is their haunting beauty. Even as they unsettle us, they hold a quiet dignity. The careful poses, the symbolism of flowers and clothing, the presence of family. These are not grotesque images, but tender ones. They embody the paradox of mourning, the desperate need to hold on, and the impossibility of doing so. In every photograph is a love story, interrupted by death yet preserved by memory. Ultimately, the modern fascination with Victorian post-mortem photography tells us that these images were never just about death. They were about love, memory, and the lengths to which the living would go to preserve what had been lost. That is their legacy, not horror, but devotion. The story of Victorian post-mortem photography is not simply about strange old pictures of the dead. It is at its core about how humans confront the most universal truth of existence, mortality. For the Victorians, death was not an abstract idea or a distant event. It was a presence woven into the fabric of their lives, an unwelcome guest that visited homes with unsettling frequency. In their grief, they turned to the most modern invention of their age, the camera, to create something ancient in purpose, a lasting memorial to those they loved. As we've seen, these photographs captured far more than lifeless bodies. They recorded the raw emotion of families clinging to memory. They reveal the rituals of mourning, the tenderness of a parent holding a child, the solemn dignity of a husband standing beside his late wife. For us today, they may look eerie or unsettling. For them, they were treasures, silent testimonies that love could outlive breath. The story of this tradition forces us to examine our own relationship with death. We live in an era where photography is effortless, yet the hardest moments of life, death, grief, and mourning, are often hidden. In a world obsessed with youth, vitality, and constant productivity, death is treated as something best ignored, tucked away in hospitals or funeral homes. But the Victorians did not turn away. They faced loss directly, and their photographs are proof of that courage. Does this mean we should return to such practices? Perhaps not in literal form. Our cultural context is different, our technologies more advanced, our rituals more varied. But the lesson is clear. To remember the dead is not morbid, it is human. Memory itself is a form of resistance against oblivion, whether in ink, in photographs, or in digital images stored on servers across the world. We cling to traces of those we love because the alternative, the silence of forgetting, is unbearable. Looking back at these photographs also reminds us of the resilience of love. The Victorians were surrounded by loss on a scale that is difficult to comprehend today. Yet they found ways to preserve tenderness amidst despair. They crafted images not to horrify but to honor. What we see as ghostly was, for them, sacred. That perspective should humble us, reminding us that every culture finds its own way to grieve, to cope, and to endure. The decline of post-mortem photography in the early 20th century did not end humanity's desire to hold on to memory. It merely shifted the method. Today we create online memorials, digital slideshows, and even AI-generated voices of the departed. The tools have changed, but the yearning remains. The Victorians' photographs are simply one chapter in a much longer story. Humanity's refusal to let go of those who leave us, and that may be the true legacy of Victorian post-mortem photography. Not the strangeness, not the discomfort, not the shock of seeing the dead posed as if alive. The legacy is love preserved in an image, love defying decay, love captured in the instant before absence swallowed presence forever. When we gaze into those faded photographs, we are not just peering into the 19th century, we are peering into ourselves, our fears, our griefs, our longing to keep hold of the people who define us. The haunting power of these images lies in their paradox. They are portraits of death that are, in truth, about life. Each one whispers the same truth, that to be human is to love and to love is to mourn. In the Victorians' willingness to photograph the dead, there is no morbid obsession. There is only an act of devotion captured in silver salts and fragile paper that outlived both the subject and the photographer. So the next time we stumble across one of these photographs, whether in a museum, on the internet, or in an old album tucked away in an attic, we should pause. Look beyond the stillness, beyond the stiff pose, beyond the centuries of dust. See instead the tenderness that lingers there. A parent unwilling to let a child's face vanish from memory. A spouse holding onto the echo of a shared life. A family confronting the void and declaring, through the lens of a camera, "You will not be forgotten." In that declaration lies the enduring relevance of Victorian post-mortem photography. It is not about the macabre. It is about memory, love, and the fragile beauty of human connection. It reminds us that even in the face of the inevitable, we seek to preserve traces of ourselves and those we cherish. And in doing so, we leave behind artifacts that speak across generations. As the shutter clicked for the last time over a silent child, or a husband or a wife, the Victorians may not have imagined their grief would still be visible nearly 2 centuries later. Yet here we are, still looking, still wondering, still moved. Their images endure because the emotions they contain are timeless. Love, grief, and memory are as much a part of us as they were of them. And as long as humans exist, they will always be. The dark history of Victorian post-mortem photography, then, is not merely a history of death. It is a history of love's refusal to surrender. It is a mirror held up to our own lives, asking us to consider what we leave behind, what memories we treasure, and how we choose to honor those we lose. And perhaps in that reflection, we find that the Victorians are not so strange after all.